The overall setup for this, and even why Banyan DAO exists, is because the user experience in Web3 has historically and still remains, let's just say, suboptimal. Why is it suboptimal? Well, who are the people that have built all these blockchains? We have needed, and we have a lot to be thankful for all of the engineers and cryptologists and people who understand Merkle trees and consensus algorithms. We have a lot to be thankful for those people that have built the blockchains for all of the demand for block space that's out there. However, if we could train people who understand how to build products for humans, who understood how to empathize with the needs of humans around the world, right? I've been seeing in the comment thread, even through the last session, how does this relate to helping people in need, right? If we could create and train humans to think, not only to understand the different aspects of what is Web3, the paradigm shifts, all of the particulars and the themes and the tools that are such in the forefront of our minds and the forefront of technology today, we potentially could do something really great. So I'm excited to have the two of you on this session because you are product managers. In fact, Yannick, you and I have been talking about this forever, and I'm glad that you're here a little bit earlier, and I'm excited for you to share your story. Jason, when you wrote your article, we shared that in our DAO, and we talked about that for quite some time. Thank you for sharing that wisdom. There's a really important angle that you stressed that I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to talk about. So, Jason, would you mind going first? Actually, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do right now professionally.
Sure. Well, thanks, Will, and glad to be with all of you today. So my name is Jason Shaw. I work on product at Alchemy. Alchemy is a blockchain development platform. So we help people build applications in Web3. That's kind of across all the verticals that I think we've been talking about today in terms of NFTs, DeFi, DAOs, gaming, you name it. And before that, I've kind of spent the last 15 years building different internet businesses, but never quite came across something as exciting as what we have the opportunity to do with Web3. I'm really excited to be here today, but also about kind of what's getting built today and more importantly, probably for the next 10 years or so.
Awesome. Yeah. Yannick?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Will. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. So currently I am head of data at Figment. Figment is an infrastructure provider in Web3, catering to token holders, institutions on the staking side, as well as on the data hub side. We are also creating a blockchain development platform, helping devs build applications in Web3 and leveraging the centralized protocols to do so.
Awesome. All right. So the theme today, and just this is the final session before our Banyan DAO co-founders and summoners sort of reflect on the day today. But the theme for this session is just now let's get practical, right? That the basic understanding of what Web3 product managers need to know to take the next steps from today. We've just spent all day learning about the different aspects of it. What would you say, what would you start out in terms of advice for people who are thinking about building in Web3? And again, feel free to just recap or approach it from new angles, because people got such a fire hose of information today. I'm sure they would appreciate a recapping from your perspective, the different elements that you think are important. So Jason, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think the thought that comes to mind is maybe kind of what are 3 things that one can do as a product person in this space that I think are most important. So I would start with number 1, a theme that I feel like I've heard today is kind of how to have a positive impact with the technology that Web3 offers. So I think starting with like what, I know it sounds really elementary, but like starting with what problem is one actually trying to solve. I think there's so much, as has been talked about, kind of like hype in the space or a lot of kind of Me Too projects or work that can happen. So I think starting with, as a product person, like what problem is this solving? I think often product managers are basically just problem solvers in a sense. Sometimes it's by building products, sometimes it's about like bringing people together to collaborate. But I think that's number one. I think number two is then, of course, like what benefit does Web3 actually offer? I think sometimes I see ideas or products that don't necessarily require using some of what's possible with blockchain technology or don't have a real clear connection to it. So I think being really thoughtful about that, I think that requires some degree of technical familiarity to understand. It's not a requirement, but I think it helps to understand, is it the idea that certain information is verified in a certain way? Is it the idea that you can, I think in one of the earlier sessions, kind of repeating this idea around like value embedded in the internet, like does that somehow make what's possible to be built different? So I think that that's a really important part, is like what is uniquely possible with Web3. And then the third thing is that I think maintaining the values of Web3, right? So it's, as I noted in the article, was kind of, I feel like the role of product management is very different in Web3, at least in today's world in 2022. And I think a job of product management that wasn't necessarily a part of it in Web2 land is to actually be thoughtful around things like community ownership or governance and how that affects product decisions that are made. And so I think that third part of it would just be around, in addition to trying to solve an important problem, which everybody should hopefully always start with, and thinking about how it can uniquely be done in a Web3 native way. I think from a technological perspective, I think the third is from a values perspective. And so those are kind of the three things that I would suggest that anybody who's thinking about Web3 product management starts with.
Love it. Love it. Yannick?
So, when people come into Web3 from the Web2 space, I think it's very intimidating at first. Everything feels very, very foreign. But when you start digging into it, you realize that people build applications in a very similar way, or at least with the same kind of layers to their tech stack as they would in Web2. They're only leveraging unique protocols and chains to accomplish the same thing they would traditionally with databases, with storage, with indexing, for example. So I think coming into the space with a lot of empathy, but also having the ability to map out the parallels between Web2 and Web3 gives you the ability to find out the unique characters of Web3 you can leverage, while also creating products that will feel familiar to your end users. So yeah, I always like to, even from a UX approach, creating things that people feel accustomed to.
Yeah, that's good. Now, one thing observing the content and the direction that the conversations have gone today, we kind of haven't hit the basics of the Web3 stack. Would you mind, Yannick, let maybe start with you, because I think for people to even understand what Figment does and how and where you work at different levels of the stack, I think would be super insightful. So could we mind just doing like a little session here of education around what is the Web3 stack?
Sure, with pleasure. So every app starts with the same base layer, which would be nodes or RPC services that would be akin to servers in the Web2 world. That allows you to interact with a chain, query it, post transactions to it. So that would be kind of the basis for your smart contract and for your app. Then you have this tech stack that will kind of depend on your vertical as a DApp. Whether you're an NFT platform, a DeFi platform, a game, a metaverse, you're going to need some different building blocks to your app. So some of those are indexing, which can be done in a centralized way or in a decentralized way with protocols like the Graph. Then you would have indexing, in this case, allows you to gather data specific to your smart contract that would not be available through full nodes, through your servers, which is very important to power a lot of the front end and provide data to the end users, but also to the team itself. Then you would have storage, which allows you, for example, to store NFTs and the files in them, So we can think of IPFS or Arweave, which would be akin to centralized storage on AWS, for example. Then you could find oracles. Oracles allow you to bring off-chain data on-chain. So essentially allowing a smart contract to know what's happening in the outside world so that it can act on specific calls. For example, trading data or the price of Bitcoin to USD at any time. So some of these protocols that come to mind would be Chainlink, Pyth, Flux, for example, varying on the chain. I think these are a bit more mature, I would say, in terms of layers of the tech stack. The next major layer that we'll see, or major layers, will be decentralized databases and decentralized identity. I think that will unlock a lot of value and create this kind of interaction between apps, as dApps will actually be built on somewhat of a common database, creating somewhat of fluid identity, which can move from one chain to another, from one wallet to another, and be recognized by apps. So instead of being a totally new user or foreign user to that app, actually your past achievements, your past assets or current assets will be recognized by these apps. So I really think that this is going to be the next kind of evolution and innovation that we'll see at the dApp level, because of this kind of unsiloing of value through shared databases.
Anything you add to that, Jason?
I think Yannick's explanation was great. I think the only brief addition that I would offer would be kind of a much more kind of short version of that might be that kind of you have nodes, right? And then you have things like developer platforms, Alchemy being one of them, and then you have the dApps that live on top of it. That's kind of an oversimplified version. I think Yannick's explanation is a great kind of robust lay of the land across a lot of the other parts of that ecosystem that are important. And then I imagine Yannick might have something on this as well. We kind of published something on this at Alchemy called the Web3 stack. So I think in general, there's a lot of great resources. If somebody just Googles kind of Web3 stack, I think the Graph also published an interesting article in the space. So I would recommend those reads. I think they're all very complementary to one another to try to get a full sense of the landscape.
Now, ideally, obviously, a PM would know all the know all the things, but that's not realistic, right? At least for those listening in and watching, what parts of the stack are most important to start with? Like, how would you recommend that journey?
You can go, Jason. I can go afterward if you want.
Sure, I'll take a quick crack, and then I'm sure you'll have great things to add to this. I guess I'd come back to the way we were talking about this before, of like, what is the problem and what is the product that is being built? And then it becomes very easy, in my opinion, of what parts of the stack to focus on. So, for example, if somebody were building a gaming application, then everything from, how we said at the base layer is like what protocol you build on becomes a lot easier to decide, right? Because somebody might choose to build a gaming application on something like Polygon or build it on Solana because of the attributes of those chains. And then the entire ecosystem around those chains becomes much more narrow, I think, because you've now limited it to a specific chain to start with. And so all the other choices of infrastructure that you have to work with are different. So again, I'm sure Yannick has some great thoughts here to add, but I guess that's how I would start with this, is just simply beginning with the product to build, as opposed to if you start with the stack. Personally, I find it very overwhelming. To your point, Will, I feel like there's a lot that product managers don't know. And one of those things is probably the entirety of the infrastructure that one could use to build something. And so one hack to limit that and maybe sort of get around that a little bit is just simply start with what one absolutely must know, which is kind of limited by what product they're building.
I would echo that absolutely. I think you start with what you want to build, and then the first layer that you're going to have to figure out is on what chain do I want my app to live. And based on what you're building, you're going to find different unique propositions for each chain. Whether you want to cover a lot of the Ethereum ecosystem, then you'll probably want to go with an EVM-based chain. If your app is a very high throughput one, you might want to look into Avalanche or Solana, for example. So, and also depending on the use case, like whether it's NFTs or DeFi, you'll look the available market and the ecosystem that will be able to become your initial users, but also the tooling available, because not all chains have the same tools available in terms of different protocols and enhancements to your tech stack. So I would say that's the first step, kind of figuring out where you want to start, where you want to live initially. I would say, though, that we're seeing an expansion of multi-chain dApps. So it's no longer Ethereum versus Solana. It's how can I expand horizontally across chains that match what I'm looking to accomplish, and how can I find more of these users and share what we're building. After that, maybe going a bit more in depth, I would say 90% of dApps have some kind of indexing, whether it's indexing that's done in-house to look at their own application, whether it's using more general indexers such as Alchemy's NFT API to get more information about the collection, the NFT collections they would be displaying, or if it's using something like subgraphs, which gives you visibility into your own smart contract. I think that's pretty ubiquitous. And then the different layers would really vary based on the use case that you're choosing.
Yeah. And really boiling it down into what's going on here. It wasn't actually until I was 3-4 years into this space that I hear somebody explain it in a way that started making sense. Because again, people coming new to this, it's like approaching the Death Star and you're in one little tiny corner of this big thing that's multifaceted and a lot going on. And you're like, what's going on here? To zoom out, it's supply and demand. And people are buying block space, right? Fundamentally, people are paying money, paying transaction fees for blocks. And what can you do with blocks? You can do tokens and NFTs and DAOs and all the DeFi things and all the things we've been talking about today. But fundamentally, what's going on is people just want block space, and they want block space for all of the reasons that are talked about in all the Twitter spaces and Discord, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you, when it comes to the areas that I think, or that you think are relatively unexplored, right? The areas of what can be done with block space that is actually exciting for the future, exciting for helping humanity. Like what are the aspects of what can be done on blocks that I think that are exciting to the two of you? Jason, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I would maybe orient around like using block space as a proxy for things that you can kind of do with blockchains. I would say, I think that you can very easily look at smart contracts generally, NFTs and DeFi just to start with. And so what I mean by this is take a look at, if you look at smart contracts as an example, like I think that they're underpinning obviously a lot of products that are being built in Web3 today, but I don't know if they're yet serving the purpose of in humanity. If let's zoom out and say there are like agreements that we would like to have happen between people that can be immutable and actually then governed with some sort of value associated with them. So specifically, one of my like favorite personal examples that I don't think has come to fruition yet is this example of like crop insurance. And there are a lot of emerging markets where there are inefficient crop markets. There's a lot of corruption. Wouldn't it be great actually if somebody had access to sort of a equitable and immutable way of actually saying like, I'm buying insurance if it doesn't rain, and then in fact I can be compensated if the weather doesn't turn out that way, using let's say an oracle that can be trusted for that data, as opposed to a middleman who then could just change their mind 2 months later and say, actually it rained more than you say it did, I'm not going to pay out the insurance contract. It's just an example of using this technological like primitive as something that can actually mediate real world problems where people can't arbitrate these sort of scenarios themselves in a reliable fashion that's sort of incorruptible, if that makes sense. And then the last two, I'll be more brief with these, but I think with NFTs, I think unfortunately it's kind of gotten this reputation just around PFPs and speculation and price and so on and so forth. But I think that folks like Chris Dixon have described it as a web page. Like I think the idea that let's say a housing deed, or let's say a membership, or let's say certain real world assets could be represented with an NFT that could then be programmable. Like I cannot use the deed to my house in some sort of digital interaction. It's just like a large set of printed papers in an office somewhere, and it's not really usable in any helpful fashion. And so I think that it's very much day zero with that primitive, where it's just around this kind of like social and speculative use case for the most part. I think things like ENS are showing like a different way forward, maybe, where you start to have these more kind of like utility oriented NFTs, where I think it actually does mean something to own your name in that sort of space of the Ethereum ecosystem, which we talk more about if it's useful. And the last, I think DeFi similarly is largely kind of, you're seeing a lot of protocols that are around like liquidity rewards and folks that are kind of rotating between different protocols or chains to try to profit in the short term financially. But in the long run, if we really could realize the potential for under collateralized lending, there are companies like Goldfinch that are doing this, for example. We're seeing companies like Syndicate try to bring investing to a more equitable state with like more flexible investing clubs. I think those are ideas that actually benefit from what's possible with the technology to try to solve these sort of more substantial problems in the world. So I think that we're starting to see across these axes a lot of maturation, but it's still very early. And so I think that's when we come back to this demand and supply and demand for block space. I think there's a sense that there will be a lot more utility over time, but right now I think a lot of that consumption might be for other purposes, which are fine. It's a marketplace. People are free to kind of compete for that. There's no value judgment there, but I think over time there will be more and more use cases that are more apparently beneficial to society that we start to see emerge as well.
How about you, Yannick?
So I'll just start by saying that, there's an interesting way to think about block space where at the same time, it is a finite resource where on a given blockchain, you have a limited capacity, but another side of the coin, you have now technologies like IBC, like parachains, like subnets, which allow you, and sharding that's coming up, that allow you to kind of spin up your own blockchains, and hence making block space a more infinite resource in some capacity. Then I'll say that for me, the most interesting use case for blockchain is to power the open metaverse. What's interesting for me, the open metaverse is a bit like Web3's iPhone moment, where we're taking Web3 primitives, DAOs, NFTs, DeFi, decentralized social, for example, and bringing all of that together on a single platform. And that's where you get that kind of cross-pollination of innovation that's going to tackle every single aspect of our lives. So, but that's not possible without blockchain and without block space. And I do point out my mention of the open metaverse because closed metaverses like MENA, do not need or do not care about these kinds of restrictions. So for me, that's going to be the biggest impact on our day-to-day, I would say, in our general lives, when we're going to be able to fully transition to a digital first life through blockchain.
So Jesse had a really powerful, in last session, he really talked about the two pedals of the bicycle, where it's stories and then status being reinforced. So it's stories and status and stories and status. And I think a lot of the reason why it's so hard to wrap our heads around Web3 is because a lot of I'm part of the problem, right? It's a lot of us are more engineering oriented, just talk about the particulars, and we don't tell enough stories about what's going on, about what Web3 is. And so the theme I've noticed in a lot of the chat throughout the sessions today is basically asking, can you tell me a story about why this is useful? Can you tell me a story about why Web3 matters? So I'm going to ask that for the two of you. You've alluded to different things, and I think there's some powerful alludes in there. But I guess I'm just going to ask, can you tell us a story for you? Maybe it had to do with your aha moment. Maybe it had to do with what you do for a living right now. But can you tell us a story about why Web3 matters?
I can start. It's maybe less a story than my thinking or how I see Web3's value. I think the most important way of building technology is open source, and open source never had a business model before Web3. So Web3 is actually creating the economic value for open source to thrive and actually expand on our capacity to innovate, in my opinion. What that means is we actually, as a community, will be able to build stuff together and not rely on corporations to take over that development, because individual contributors will now be able to be incentivized for the work that they do. So at its core, I think that's the most important thing for me for Web3.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting, Yannick. I think I would add, so this is I guess a brief story of the notion of permissionless, right? And like what that can mean and the power of it. So I previously did work in, let's call it Web2, whatever you want to call it, like at Airbnb for a few years. And I remember one of the really interesting experiences that I had was that the company identified that actually certain people on the platform who had less common, maybe not Anglo-Saxon names, would be discriminated against more often. They would have their bookings rejected at a higher rate than people with similar attributes, otherwise similar ratings and everything like that. So the company ran a really interesting experiment where they stopped sharing that information pre-booking. And they actually noticed that it made a change overnight, and all of a sudden the bias was removed by doing that. Even though at first there was some consternation because as a host, you wanted to maybe see the face or know the name of the person who was going to stay with you. And that was great. And that was a great win for making a change. The reason why I'm bringing that up, and I think it's relevant, is what's so interesting in Web3 is that I'm noticing there are people who are 13 years old in emerging market building these really powerful DeFi protocols. And nobody really knows who they are necessarily. They're just somebody with a cartoon picture and they made up a name. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I think real world identity is really important. But it's been so exciting to see this permissionless building happening where people aren't being judged as much based on like where they were born or what they look like. And it's more about what you can add to the system. I think a lot of, even though, you know, we somewhat joke about NFT collections and maybe some of them are speculative or what have you, isn't it great that like people can just kind of make art? Nobody's telling you whether or not you can put something in a gallery or whether or not we're going to list you on the platform. And I say this as somebody who was like born in the USA, went to fairly good schools. I feel like I've been able to have a lot of opportunities. And yet I feel like my parents who immigrated from India and a lot of like the kind of the life that I could have been living if I didn't have access to all these things would be very different. And so I think that it's still very early days. I think that's what's so hard about Web3 is like, well, it is a great question because it is hard to like come up with, here's 10 great, amazing stories about the value of Web3 if we're being really honest, I think. It's just a hard question too, to be fair, but I think it's because I think Web3 is happening at a time that's after 20 years of Web2 developing. And so there's so many eyes on the internet now that weren't necessarily there in the same way. Of course, there were the New York Times articles and the Today Show interviews about like, what is the internet and is it a fad? But it's like 100 times that now because the internet plays such a more important role in our lives in 2022 compared to 2002. So I think, anyway, I would just close by saying I think it is a hard question. It is an important question. I think there are good and exciting stories, but at the same time, I think it's worth recognizing humbly that it is super early and the degree of scrutiny that the space receives is like fair, but it's because I think the internet is very different than it was and more important than it was 20 to 30 years ago.
Yeah. Because in the early days of Banyan DAO, when we were talking about, okay, let's level up in Web3, I actually started writing a textbook. I come from an academic background, kind of an engineering approach. I started writing a textbook and I just listed it all out. DAOs, DeFi, metaverses, boom, boom, boom. Here's all this stuff. And it, very insightful and very blunt, which I respect greatly. A member of Banyan DAO said, well, this is great, but you're just telling me all the stuff. Like you're giving me all the particulars, like you're laying out all the ingredients. but how can I think about solving real world problems with all of this? Right. And I think this person was essentially asking, Will, tell me a story. So now that I've had time to think about it myself since asking the question, here's my story. And I believe this is a true story. You can fact check me. Once upon a time, there were a bunch of people who lived in the mountains of Oregon, and they wanted to have access to the internet. They figured out a way to chain the internet from house to house to house, from peak to valley, from peak to valley, from peak to valley, so that everybody could get internet via the moving of the satellites and all that. But they needed to figure out a way to share costs. How, if you're sharing all this internet, how is everybody going to pay for it? So somebody said, hey, there's this thing called blockchains and smart contracts where we can actually meter each other's usage of the internet. And they were able to successfully coordinate as a community in the mountains to share the cost of the internet. I believe that's actually a true story. And that's a use case for how to solve a real world problem with blockchain. Now, obviously, a lot of the real world problems that are being solved are in the nuances and niches of DeFi, right? Financial instruments that most of us don't understand. A lot of the problems that are being solved are around using digital ownership of NFTs to do things like incentivize your community, right? It's kind of abstract. It's so far abstract from real things. How would you, now it doesn't have to be full on story mode, but instead of going from the bottom up where you're describing the particulars of Web3 and then trying to get people to understand solving use cases, how would you, this is another hard question, how would you approach it from a top down, right? How would you say, okay, Web3 product manager, thematically, these are the types of problems that can be solved with Web3, then go look at the particulars.
I can start. So Web3 blockchains, these are tools. You shouldn't try to force any use case into it. You should try to solve things that are impossible to solve without it. One that I'm very fond of is data ownership. I don't think you can truly own your data until you actually tokenize it. So allowing you to create your digital identity, your digital self, by tokenizing not only the data that's held on Facebook, on Twitter, but also every time you interact with a dApp, now you're composing your cross-chain, your Web2, your Web3 identities into one, tokenizing that. And now you can truly say that you own this data in the form of an NFT, for example. And then that data can actually be sold directly to companies by you, but also tracked. Every time it's sold, you could get royalties on the selling of your data. You could revoke access at any time. These are problems that will not be solved without Web3.
Yeah, I like that. Jason, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great formulation. I think one additional perspective would be that, I think one of the things that people are excited about with Web3 is this idea around incentives and coordination. And so another top-down way of looking at this is that if you start from a place of saying, well, okay, great, tokens allow you to start to incentivize people. You see this, of course, with even things like, I think a good example in a positive sense is something like what ENS has done, or what even Optimism did this week, I think, by having novel forms of incentivizing their communities that are about like long-term value creation. And so there's incentives and there's coordination, because now whether it's through DAOs or whether it's through communities that are based on NFTs, or whether it's based on actual smart contracts that help coordinate between humans and computers in new ways, I think that gives you new primitives again to solve problems. Now, what people do with that and which problems they choose to solve in the world, I think there's all sorts of, I think 2022 is definitely a time where we see all sorts of important problems in the world that have cropped up. And I won't be super lofty right now with kind of what I think is out there that could potentially be solved by Web3, but I think that there's an opportunity at least to use what are very important primitives, which I don't think the internet really has had in as powerful of a fashion before, to start to try to solve whatever problem somebody does actually care about.
So we have about 10 minutes left or so. If anybody has questions, feel free to like raise your emoji hand or put it in the chat here. But yeah, I was just going right there, Trace. I actually think the optimism story and what they announced this week is a beautiful example of what can actually pull together a lot of the learnings of what we've talked about today. Because optimism is a layer 2, it's an optimistic roll up. Like there's a lot of interesting things to learn there in the Ethereum ecosystem. They've announced a new governance model between their citizen house and their token house. And they are diverting fractions of block space to try to retroactively pay for public goods. Now, talk about an amalgamation of stories based on what Optimism just released that I think actually helps educate people to level up into becoming Web3 product managers. For those of you who know the story, can you share what is Optimism? What did they talk about? And let's dive into those particulars a little bit, if you wouldn't mind.
You want to take it, Jason? I'm not super well versed.
Sure. I mean, I actually think, well, you kind of like summarized some of what they did this week with their collective quite well. What would be most helpful in terms of, I don't know the level of familiarity in terms of L2s here or the role that they play in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I just, a lot of people are just approaching this relatively earlier in their journey, right? We did breakout sessions and most people said, oh, I'm relatively new to Web3, but I work for this large company or this growing tech company, and I'm trying to get us, ahead of the game, right? I'm trying to help our company come into the future. So the Optimism story, just by understanding the different pieces of that story, is actually a really helpful way to wrap everything together, I think, at the end of today. So whether you know what happened, the particulars of what happened or not, just talking about why are L2s, right? Yannick, you mentioned, this is probably a good like sub question here to put a pin in it. You mentioned Cosmos ecosystem, a bunch of like subnets and an internet of blockchains versus what Ethereum is doing, which has side chains and rollups. Can you just talk about that difference? That might be a good way to sort of start the conversation here.
Sure. Well, it's a pretty clear differentiation. So Avalanche has subnets, Cosmos ecosystems as zones, Polkadot as parachains. Each of them are meant to be application native blockchains. So one app, one chain, generally speaking. They were designed that way. Rollups and L2s are meant to be scalability solutions to Ethereum. So for rollups, for example, they still send the traffic to Ethereum in a way, but the computing happens on Optimism or off-chain in some capacity. So it's not giving every app its own blockchain to kind of silo the usage of any chain. It's more about scaling the underlying layer 1, which is Ethereum in this case.
That's great. Yeah, that's super helpful. Okay, now let's see. I'll toss it to you, Jason. What do you have opinions about? Because there's lots of different ways of approaching the scalability trilemma, right? The decentralization, the scaling, and the security aspects, and it's famous, right? You usually have to sacrifice one of those. Do you have a preference, or in the Web3 world, which is your like what you're most attracted to in terms of solving the scalability trilemma?
It's a great question. The short answer, not to have a cop out, is I don't have a personal preference. I kind of view it as, coming back to that conversation around permissionlessness, I think the other side of it is kind of the space for people to experiment and explore. And that's why I think it's great that there are so many different approaches to the layer 1 ecosystems, or scaling as a solution, and different approaches to doing that. So I don't have a personal view necessarily on kind of of the trilemma, where to prioritize. You are seeing that trade-off, of course, in terms of certain layer ones maybe giving up the decentralization to get kind of like faster and better like scalability as a result, and that's a choice. And then you see things like Ethereum and its ecosystem. I think I'm more of the philosophy of let, you know, 1,000 flowers bloom, and we can kind of allow the technology and the communities that are developing around them to kind of experiment and then see what is most effective at trying to solve the problems that we've been talking about throughout this conversation.
It's a really great perspective from a product manager. That in itself is actually a beautiful answer. So I totally respect that. Okay, go ahead.
You would love to add to that. I think a bit like picking your tech stack, I think it ends up being the choice of the team that builds its app, and it's a trade-off based on their use case. I think when we get to a more mature ecosystem, people will understand that trade-off better. They will understand that if they need full decentralization because their use case requires, you know, no trust and total certainty in you know, the preservation of the assets, for example, then they will pick one chain. If they don't care as much, they prefer high throughput, they'll go for more centralized options, I would say. So I think it's going to end up being the choice of apps once they understand these trade-offs better. And to Jason's point, I think what we're trying to accomplish, what Alchemy is trying to accomplish, is to not pick, you know, a winner. It's more to give the tools to access any of those options so that devs can choose and interact with them seamlessly.
Per Mike's question in the chat there, will blockchain follow Moore's law?
I guess I don't know in that sense, meaning in terms of if we expect kind of what block space to double
It just can't get faster and faster and cheaper.
I think at a spiritual level, like I think yes, meaning right, like I think the kind of explosion of capacity in a general sense, or the explosion, I feel like people have also used this to refer kind of colloquially to things around like applications in a space or revenue that's possible to be generated, or hopefully things like impact. In that sense, I think there is something to the like idea that there starts to be more of an exponential kind of impact here. I don't know where we are in the, people have made attempts at describing like where we are in the Web3 journey, and whether this is, you know, right, like 1992 is 1998, is it 2000? Nobody really knows. And it's maybe like a false attempt at trying to retrofit it into some sort of past historical precedent, which it may not follow to the T. So spiritually, I do think there is this effect of kind of seeing this exponential ramp up. I don't know where we are though right now in this journey, and whether or not, and at a technical level, I'd be less clear on what the relationship is there.
Yeah, on my side, I would say the Moore's law is at its core an exponential law. I think we'll see an exponential growth in terms of number of blockchains, number of apps, number of users. I think the kind of trade-off, unless incredible scientific breakthrough, you know, happens, I don't think we're going to fully solve the scalability trilemma, for example. So then it's going to be finding where you fit within that spectrum, innovating within it. And yeah, I would tend to say that that kind of scalability will come through, you know, sharding and new blockchains, rather than finding a way to make Solana 1000x more effective than it is today.
Yeah. All right, so final question, very practically for those listening in. Thanks everybody for being here today. We're going to finish the session with bringing on members of Banyan DAO and talk a little bit about the next season of Banyan DAO. But final question for the two of you is, how do you keep up? Like, what we've talked about the innards of crypto Twitter and Discords and whatnot, and it's just so confusing. How do the two of you, like, how do you keep up with this space? What tools would you recommend for people listening in, just to continue to learn and continue to level up their skills?
First, I say, oh, thanks. First, I'll say that to get started in this space, don't try to know everything about everything. I think you benefit from picking a vertical that you want to excel in, whether it's NFTs, whether it's DeFi, whether it's DAOs, whether it's metaverses or games, because you can't keep up with everything. Once you build that expertise, it's easier to kind of have a basic understanding of everything that's happening in terms of primitives and technological development. Then it's simply interacting with apps. I think Jason and I have a very unique position where we get to interact with every new dApp out there that's building the craziest shit, which allows us to know what the hell's coming up. But otherwise, I would say crypto Twitter is my friend, Discord is my enemy. And yeah, pick your battles.
It's good.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. It kind of made me realize that if the metaphor was like drinking water is similar to trying to learn Web3, I feel like I've personally made the mistake of just like literally trying to drink from that fire hose, right? And you actually don't come away with anything. You just get hit by the water, and then you have no idea what's going on. Whereas at least if you're like, okay, I'm going to learn about NFTs, you take a day, try to use a series of products and buy some, or at least like look into the metadata and start to learn, like it's a little bit more doable. I think it's really hard because everything is so linked in Web3 that this idea of going down the rabbit hole is something that has a lot of gravitational pull towards it. And so it's very hard to sort of segment off and say, I'm going to stop here because there's so many new things to learn. But I think, yeah, Yannick, I think nailed it. It's just like plugging into these communities somehow. And if the Twitter works for you, like developing a plugged in signal, like maybe go look at the people that Yannick and I follow and follow some of them too, if they look interesting to you. And before you know it, you kind of have this set of signal that's flowing through, and then you'll see what they're talking about and go, maybe one of them would have shared the optimism news, and then you read about that and be like, oh, that's really interesting. But I do think following your nose and like just trying to see what you're interested in, keep an open mind. There are so many things that have happened in Web3 that I would have never predicted would have happened. And so there's no easy answer. And like, I think that there's so much information out there that I think Yannick's advice is spot on, of just trying to like pick something, understand it well, and then if there's something new you're interested in, follow your passion there as well. And eventually you'll find your community and set of products that are most interesting.
Love it. Love it. And if somebody wouldn't mind just putting Jason and Yannick's Twitter URLs in the chat, as well as Jason's article, because I realized that people might not know what we were talking about earlier. If somebody could post those 3 links, that would be really, really helpful. Well, Jason, Yannick, this has been really, really insightful. I tossed some pretty hard questions your way. Thanks for being willing to roll with it. And I couldn't be more excited about your 2 companies and projects that you're up to. And yeah, excited to continue the conversation online. Thanks for being here.
Awesome.
Thank you for having us.